Thanks for having us, everyone. I'm Aidan, and this is Natallia, and we're from Catherine Clay. And today, we'd really like to talk about democracy, and in particular, public attitudes towards democracy. So, for those of you who don't know us, we're a communications firm that works mainly with think tanks and universities. And our interest in democracy is actually in our brand statement, which is we help policy experts shape conversations that strengthen democracy. But if we're honest, the truth is that the relationship between think tanks and democracy isn't always that clear. Some argue that at their best, think tanks are, create a political culture which encourages public debates, and they function as just as important as the research function, for example, within think tanks. But then you have others who argue that think tanks undermine democracy by promoting policies for vested interests under the shadow of darkness behind closed doors without proper scrutiny. But either way, to our mind, it seems clear to us that think tanks flourish in an environment which is free, which is open, which is pluralistic. However, for anyone who's been following, politics for the past 5 or 6 years, you could be forgiven for wondering whether, Western society's commitment to democracy has been faltering. And let me try and present. I won't be able to see all of you, so I'm going to assume that everything's fine unless I hear otherwise. But this is a spread of the kind of headlines that we're talking about. And depressingly, this slide was pretty easy to pull together. It didn't take too much effort. We didn't have to look too hard. So, for example, in recent years in the UK, we've seen mainstream politicians accused of pandering to an urban liberal elite. We've seen Parliament accused of delaying Brexit and attempts to bypass Parliament through prorogation. We've seen judges accused of being the enemies of the people. We've seen the mainstream media accused of liberal bias. And similarly in the US under the Trump administration, we saw the mainstream media accused of being the enemy of the people. Sound familiar? Congress bypassed by executive order. Mainstream politicians accused of pandering to an urban liberal elite. And we see this across a number of countries in Europe as well, and I believe further afield. So we'd love to hear from all of you from your experience on this, and we'll hopefully get to that in the discussion. And of course, this all seems like this can all seem academic until it's not, right? The storming of the Capitol in the US has really showed what can happen when tensions boil over. In Europe, we've had far-right nationalists in Poland and Hungary carried into power by public unrest, or public discontent. In France, the next presidential election is shaping up to be a plebiscite on mainstream politics. So in this context, it's worth asking, to what extent does this reflect a genuine change in public attitudes towards democracy? Have the public fallen out of love with democracy? And are these shifts in attitudes being driven by the public itself or by the political elites? So we're going to take you through some findings from polling that we ran in the UK and the US, and in both markets, these were nationally representative samples. The numbers for both countries were actually very similar So we've only included the UK ones for simplicity, but where there are differences, significant differences, we might flag them. But overall, the data was like pretty much was very, very similar in UK and US. If anything, the US ones were slightly more polarized. But so from what we've seen, we can certainly start to think that there's some alignment across Western countries. Though we'd love to hear from you if you've observed something different in your own countries. And once we're done, we'll bring in Sonya Stojanovic, hopefully, like, you know, if she's in the audience, and Tom Jeffrey to share their views on this. And I'll say a bit more about them when we get to it. But since these are early findings, we'd also be interested in your reflections on this. So we're open to ideas, we're open to challenges, and we're hoping to make this an open discussion. Feel free to be critical friends to us. Anyway, let me hand over at this point to Natallia, who will talk you through some of the findings.
Thank you, Aidan. So if we go to the first slide, you'll see that we are off to an interesting, maybe not very surprising start. So our research suggests that people are disenchanted with politics, and we can definitely see this some growing political fatigue of people losing faith in the political systems and the structures, and people losing trust and or doubting those who represent them. But this has been around, that this disposition has been around for a long time now, so essentially nothing extraordinary new here. And that being said, the support for key democratic values such as freedom of speech, rule of law, and democracy itself, it does remain relatively strong. So when we set out the research, we did assume that we might find the decline in support for democracy, a little bit different data, different numbers, but as you can see from here, it does show a different picture. Of course, I guess there are different ways of looking at this graph, and you can choose to focus that only 2/3 of the population do express support for these values. But we, within our team, we did decided to concentrate on the fact that only 6% of the population didn't support them. The next breakdown that we have is showing the support for key state institutions. And if you just pay some attention to the bottom right, so you see that domestically, police and the military, they do enjoy relatively high support, with universities and judiciary a little bit further down. Internationally, the UN and NATO, they're still doing okay, but politicians and mainstream media, they have very low levels of support. And again, just to remind here, this is UK statistics, but as Aidan mentioned earlier, US numbers, they actually look quite similar, both in terms of support for police and mistrust for politicians and media. Another one of our assumptions was that people would generally be supportive of democracy in the abstract, quite abstract terms. So things got interesting when we started looking at the trade-offs that the practice of democracy entails. So in light of recent attempts, both in the UK and the US, to bypass the legislature, we want to ask how public feels about executives imposing their own agenda or their own decisions. And we asked if people thought that democracy gets in the way of government getting things done. So you can see from the chart on the left that 25% of the population do agree with this statement. So they do think that the democracy gets in the way. And further, 39%, they are on the fence with the issue, with only 36% agreeing. And if you look at the right side now, you will find that quite a similar picture on the question whether government should be able to bypass parliament. So quite a mixed response when we talk about trade-offs. Okay, so we also wanted to test the commitment to certain values, in particular here, freedom of speech against economic growth, mainly in the face of Western economies performing much slower than China, for example. And we found that 48% would still prefer to have freedom of speech over economic growth, and with only 14% of population disagreeing and 1/3 on the fence with this issue. Okay, and because we are obviously currently witnessing some big challenges to multilateralism, we wanted to ask public opinion on international cooperation, and we found that only 18% of the population felt that UK should retreat from international institutions like the UN. But quite a large number, still 45%, were hesitant to give a certain answer. And when we introduce potential trade-offs again with national interest, you can see that only 25% of the population felt bound by international rules. And this is it from me, so I'll give it back to Aidan for more details.
Thank you. So traditionally, think tanks have been more interested, I guess, in policymakers and the media, and policy experts have tended to portray the general public as pretty volatile, needing the guidance of technocrats, like to guide them through the complexities and the nuances of the political systems that we live in. So we decided to test whether there were any differences, like in perceptions between those at the heart of the political system and the general public. And for this, we used a segmentation. This is a segmentation that we've used many times already, according to levels of political engagement. So we think of this broadly as concentric circles. So at the center are insiders. I should add that those are not exact concentric circles. So you might have people, you might have a few people who are insiders but not activists. So it's not direct read across, but it broadly gives us a model to gauge political engagement. And so in the center are insiders, defined as those as people who answered that they work in politics or policy. Just one level out of that, we've got a group we've called the activists, so people who are politically active. So these might include, for example, party activists or campaigners, or trade unions, lobbyists, etc. A little further out, we define the engaged as people who have taken political action in the recent past. So, for example, they've contacted their member of parliament or representative. They've signed a petition, for example, or they've taken part in a march. And then the spectator in black is simply those who report being interested in politics. And then, the outring is obviously the overall general public, including those not interested in politics. And the question we wanted to explore was, were the guardians of democratic institutions at the heart of the system, protecting it from the volatile public? And, well, the data tells us not quite. What we found is that spectators, in other words, the general public interested in politics, were actually significantly more likely to support democratic principles than insiders. And this was true actually across most of the charts that we went through earlier. So here, for example, you see the differential is somewhere between is somewhere around the mark of 10 and even up to 15 percentage points. So a few highlights that we found, which I guess it led us to think that arguably the interested public has kept a cooler head than those at the center. So compared to insiders, spectators were 15 percentage points more likely to deny that democracy gets in the way of getting things done. Spectators were 20 points less likely to think the government should be able to bypass parliament. And they were 80 percentage points more likely to think that the UK should take part in international institutions. And actually, it was even stronger in in the UK than in the US on that note. Interesting. So I guess here is our question: are the public really the problem? In this. And what we do get is a real sense that the political system has been overrun by an urban liberal elite. Right, we see kind of 61% agreement with the idea that society is too politically correct. 60%, being tired of urban elites telling them what's best for them. Tiring of of virtue signaling in society, for example. And perversely, this is a feeling which insiders are playing to. And perhaps overplaying, arguably. So we see, for example, somewhere between 15 10 and 15% percentage point differences between insiders and spectators on those. So are they over-egging the issue? And we see this gap in perceptions here. This is one of our earlier slides about support for institutions, and this time broken down by our audience segments. And there's a big gap in how politicians and the media are trusted, among spectators and insiders, between the public who are interested in in politics and those on the inside. So these are just a few early findings on this. But before we go away, we wanted to open this up for conversation and see what everyone's interpretation of the data was. And so let me try and bring in Tom and so let me introduce you to Tom, Jeffrey, and Sonya Stojanovic. Tom, for context, used to work at the Institute for Fiscal Studies in London, long considered a barometer of responsible policy making, about both left and right-wing governments. And after many years in think tank, he now works for Apolitical, which is a platform that connects civil servants with external expertise. And Sonya, you might recognize from a session yesterday, is the former director at the Belgrade Center for Security Policy and founder of Public Engagement, and she's been observing the democratic transitions in process in the Balkans and the role that think tanks have played along the way. And she's worked as a consultant equally with civil society and governments in Eastern Europe and the Middle East, including Egypt and Palestine. So welcome both of you. Thanks for joining. And I guess maybe starting with with Sonya. So we've looked at UK and the UK data. The US data we found was very aligned with this. But from your experience of a bit kind of going beyond just the UK and the US markets, does this align with what you've seen in Central and Eastern Europe, for example, and beyond?
Mm-hmm. So thank you for inviting me to the floor for my favorite topic, democracy and think tanks. I want to contribute with three perspectives. One is directly answering your question, Aidan, on what are similarities and differences between UK, US, and the eastern part of Europe. The other part would be on what these findings that you presented mean for the work of think tanks outside of the Western Northern center of international policymaking. So what are the consequences for advocacy and functioning of organizations in Central Eastern Europe and other parts of global periphery? And a third part I want to share is just some questions that practically in my work I faced when facing this dilemma on how think tanks could position in relation to democracy. But let me go back to the first empirical thing. Some of the things that you presented for UK are relevant also for Eastern Europe, and that's the trend of distrust in political elites, in media, and generally policy processes. One big difference that exists in Central and Eastern Europe is that ordinary citizens frequently also distrust institutions. So it's not just elites and processes, but the institutions that are distrusted, and especially the institutions that play a key role in checks and balances in democracies. So parliaments and judiciary are among the least trusted in Serbia, in Russia, Ukraine, even Poland, Hungary, and so on. So even in EU member states. The institutions that enjoy the trust are those that actually do not use deliberative and democratic processes enforcing rules, but it's security institutions. So police and very frequently military. And this is also an indicator that has been proven in a research, for example, done by Friedrich Hebert Stiftung, Vienna office, security radar, that many of the countries in the East perceive that their state security is endangered and their way of life is endangered. And this is where the understanding of democracy becomes more complicated. Because I've looked at the data and, there is finding that there is a unique culture that should be protected, unique culture of the states that should be protected. And, autocrats are actually challenging that liberal democracy is not nationally owned, but it's kind of imposed from outside. So this is a big framing. There is distrust in institutions, democratic institutions. There is distrust in processes, and also there is not much of the lived experience of functioning democracy. So there was a huge promise after the fall of Berlin Wall, huge sacrifices that ordinary citizens had to go through with transformation of their economy, way of life, losing much of the benefits that they might have enjoyed during communist times. In everyday living, and then they saw that many of the elites actually betrayed these promises, as our colleagues from South Africa said, for their own private good and not for democratic good. So I would say what you presented as a challenge in the West, it's way more emphasized in the East. But going back to the second point, and this is what this, crisis of democracy in the West means for the rest of us, it's really a serious concern in two regards. One is that the actors like myself and other colleagues, who perceive democracy as at least the least worst solution and possibly the best political regime we can live in, are losing the role models that we can refer to. So there are more and more concerning events in Western democracies, as you, Aidan, highlighted the example of invasion of Capitol Hill, or different kinds of non-democratic resolution of issues that are used by our autocrats to justify why it is okay to bend the rules. And I'll give the real-life example, a statement by a president of my country in relation to the criticisms that media are being pressured, intimidated, especially investigative journalists. He actually said that it's not that bad situation because the journalists in Serbia are not killed, referring indirectly to killing of a journalist in Slovakia and Malta in EU member states. So this is, the framing of democracy doesn't function there, so why would you expect it to function here? So this is a very serious issue in our framing of expectations. The other, even more difficult issue in everyday functioning of think tanks in our world, part of the world, is we are losing allies. we are losing champions that would support our efforts. And more, we are facing, situations like the other day, my colleagues told me they had a meeting with American ambassador here in Belgrade, who responded to the criticism by civil society on, the pressures, the name calling in parliament, by ruling party MPs against the civil society and journalists. He said, "Oh, come on, it's not that bad as in Russia." Or the other example we heard is, you are still not Turkey, meaning, people are not put in prison and not beaten indiscriminately. So as long as, the legislation is discussed in parliament and rules of the game are rewritten in legal way, and, there is pressure, there is smear campaigns, but you are not arrested, you haven't disappeared, it's not that bad, you are losing an agency to get support. I'm not saying, declaratively, we hear support for rule of law and democracy also in our part of the world, but we also hear as a policy orientation, so-called pragmatic approach, or what we call stabilocracy. As long as you are stable and you are not falling again into bloody wars of the 90s, we don't care about the other more sophisticated type of problems such as democracy. And in this kind of environment, it's very difficult to secure support. And I'll since I'm giving this speech for too long, just to wrap up. So what does it mean? I think each organization needs to decide for their own approach. And I had colleagues, especially dealing, for example, with economic issues, that think that it's better to engage with autocrats and to deliver concrete policy change than to confront them directly. And they justify it with, we are delivering concrete good for people, so let's not engage in politics. And then there are other organizations that are engaged in documenting erosion of democracy or trying to slow it down, to put, as they said, a defense in a wall that is going, in a dam that is going to break. So to try to slow down the process. And here I see a challenge, both in how to engage with those abroad that used to be our main allies, but also more importantly, how to engage at home with people. And I think from your presentation, the key question is how to expand the spectators group, the group that cares, that is interested, especially in this context where liberal democracy is perceived as something which is not homegrown, compatible to domestic values. And last point is the research done by my colleagues in Serbia shows that people care about the local issues. So they get afraid by the high politics issues like wars and, interventions and so on. But the kind of issues that would mobilize them to do something are very, very local. So it's, the endangerment of their park by the corrupt constructor with the support of the politicians. And this is a challenge for think tanks on how you get engaged in these super localized issues. And I think you need partnership with social movements and great grassroots organizations. So I'll stop here.
Brilliant, thank you. Thank you, Sonya. So we've got the idea that this actually kind of this has repercussions, so these kind of patterns in Western European countries have repercussions beyond beyond our own borders. But Tom, I'm going to point you as as the voice of domestic politics here. Does this actually, so thinking about, think tanks in each of, in their domestic, in their domestic countries, like in the UK, UK think tanks in the UK, US think tanks in, India. Does it matter? Does it matter to can think tanks just go about their business, outside of, in an environment in which, a certain number of democratic values are being are being, I think, threatened as maybe just wrong, but certainly kind of being questioned.
I mean, first thing to say, it's lovely to be back at the Think Tank Conference, and thank you to everyone who's joined us this afternoon. Really great to be here. Thank you also to Cass from Clay, who have a history of asking the interesting questions. So always great to see you, Cass from Clay Research. I think the extraordinary thing really, focusing in on UK politics and the UK think tank sector is how much the sector has continued on as normal. We're now, I don't know how long, almost half a decade since Michael Gove got up and said, the British people have had enough of experts from acronyms, I think was the term he used, telling the public what they should think. And I think surveying the sector and having worked in think tanks, having also edited Think Tank Review, which was focused on the UK think tank sector and public policy in general, the operating models, a lot of the activities that think tanks have done since that defining moment where Michael Gove took aim at the think tanks hasn't changed. There hasn't been a substantial response to the challenge that Michael Gove laid down in the days of the EU referendum, where there was potentially a crisis point for the think tank model of elite influence.
I guess are we giving, and this is a question maybe for both of you, thinking about the difference in in support for democratic principles among insiders and spectators that we've observed, are we giving the public a bad rep? Are we are we not are we failing to give them enough credit?
I think maybe I'll come in quickly on this. I think that the term populism comes with a lot of baggage. It's been sort of not, briefcases on a long haul flight. It often sums up a lot of inchoate fears rather than describing actual political phenomena. So one of the problems with how populism is talked about is there is this idea that the charismatic leader is appealing directly to the people, and so circumventing those who would know how to steer the ship of state. And so we have this notion that an Orban, a Trump, rises from nowhere, connects directly with the people, and all of a sudden we're moving out of the ordinary territory of law and political convention. But that's not really what happens, right? And I think one of the things we sort of lose in that narrative is that there is an institutional game here, in a sense. So one of the reasons for Trump's success is, the remarkable degree to which the Republican Party, which is an instrument for monopolizing executive power in the US, backed him and went along with the Trump program, continues to go along in a lot of ways with the Trump program. And the same is true of Boris Johnson. I don't make this as a political point in the slightest. I think many Conservatives will agree with me, but the Conservative Party in the UK is a very effective way of monopolizing power, and has been remarkably effective in the decades that it's operating in capturing power and securing it for the people who make it up. So the idea that these leaders are operating outside of some institutional context, kind of directly connecting with the public and wreaking havoc on our institutions just isn't the case. Let's not forget that Michael Gove is an old hand in the Conservative Party. He helped set up Policy Exchange, which is an acronym, in 2002. So, the desire to get direct access to executive power, it's not surprising that insiders are keen to expand that access, invoking a sort of nameless, faceless public.
I may add, I believe that those that we call populists are actually engaging way more with people than think tanks. I mean, think tanks are usually very bad in engaging directly, except from maybe public opinion polls with citizens. We are more used to talking to all other types of audiences or groups, and even these worst populists, besides their big games in rewriting the rules through institutions and telling the stories about, as Orban did, that illiberal democracy is the right type of democracy for Hungary. They actually go grassroots, and they do engage, and they do listen, and they do provide services. So Poland is famous for actually providing a lot of welfare for those that were left behind, elderly, rural population, what we call losers of transition. So people who did not benefit from transition to democracy and the market, and who were kind of left behind. And I think in our part of the world, not that much maybe in former Yugoslavia, but in Eastern Europe that was part of Warsaw Pact, in 90s, it was forbidden to question anything related to democracy and the West, because it was an escape from really bad, political experience of the communism. So it was a taboo to actually debate democracy. And I think democracy functions as long as we can ask any questions and debate it and see what are the benefits for us. So to conclude, I think as think tankers, we need to find ways either directly to engage with citizens. And I a great example that my colleagues from North Macedonia did in partnership with the Stanford University using deliberative polling in a country which was super polarized, at the edge of really turning to even worse authoritarianism. They had really good debates on democracy and discrimination with ordinary citizens. So as one example, and maybe a British example I'm most familiar with, is Demos. I understand that they not only engage with people on the questions that they formulated, but they actually ask people to formulate the questions, to formulate the task, or for us, the colleagues there from Switzerland, with their policy kitchen and really engagement of people of different walks of life in formulating scenarios and policy proposals.
Thank you. What do you like? Sonia, I'm going to go back to you for a second on this one. What do you think is at stake here? In terms, so we talked about this in the engagement, between kind of think tanks and the public, and I think we've discussed this extensively in terms of in terms of yes, it's saying talking to the public, educating, but it's also about listening and kind of feeding feeding their views into the policy process. What's the stake? And I'm thinking, for example, in a country like the UK, the US, relatively stable democracy up until now. What's the stake in these countries, and how does it differ, or does it differ from the countries which are maybe a bit newer to the democracy game?
I think there is a difference in imagination. I was born and raised in Belgrade, and I lived in 4 or 5 states. So I never, I've changed location within the same city, but the name of my country changed, and the political system and so on. So I can imagine how break of checks and balances and capture of media and misuse of media for fear mongering can lead to violence. And both within the state, but also with the neighbors. I mean, it's a so short path to bringing to a break of institutions and different types of resolution of conflicts. And what I've seen engaging with colleagues from the Western Europe is that it's very difficult for them to engage how quickly you can go to more violent or more volatile situation, because many of the generations, especially in Western Europe, do not remember any major war, you know, in their life close to home. It's always somewhere there. So I think that's one difference. The other difference is I believe that your institutions are still more resilient and groups. Because we didn't have that much of experience, it was easier also to dissolve the institutions that functioned well. But I think the danger is the same, and that is that we stop talking to each other, we distrust each other, and then we resolve conflicts by other means than political means, whether it's low scale, you know, hate crime kind of speech, or right-wing violence by informal policing groups that we've seen, for example, in Slovakia, in Germany, you know, groups attacking migrant camps on their own, or in Austria. I mean, I think that's the worst example, where you had at some point even these right-wing groups in the government attacking an anti-terrorist, hijacking the anti-terrorist police unit and taking all the evidence on right-wing extremists from the police unit. So, you know, I think it's quite dangerous when the boundaries of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable are erosive, and we no longer have a basic consensus in society to care about each other. And this is, for me, a discussion on democracy.
Tom, did I see you going to?
Yeah, I think I'd probably take a shallower perspective than Sonya's, partly, you know, just because, you know, we're at a think tanks conference rather than a public event. So people here are from research institutions in and around. I see the risk really as competitive pressure. You know, as I was kind of referring to earlier, I think there is just more competition to get your hands on the levers of executive power, you know, from the party apparatus itself in the form of, you know, Boris Johnson or Donald Trump indeed, but also in the sort of so-called marketplace of ideas, right? Think tankers are not the only providers of new ideas for government. Whether it's because government is setting up its own brain trusts in various forms, you know, it is doing its own service design, it is doing its own behavioral insights, it is doing its own, creating its own policy professions, or whether it's from universities, which are becoming increasingly, you know, active in the policy formulation space. So I see it as competitive pressure. Competition on the side of power and ideas. And the issue for think tanks, I believe, is that without more public engagement, it is just too easy for them to be, you know, described as faceless elite institutions. And the recent history, and I'm happy to go into sort of an example of this, shows that think tanks haven't been very good at responding to questions leveled either at them individually or at the sector as a whole around their integrity and independence. There is an attitude, I think, where think tanks say, well, you know, we publish our funding and we're clear about how we do policy influence, so we'll be all right. And they don't, you know, do anything active, or they don't do anything collectively to combat accusations of influence peddling.
Please do go into an example. If
Well, I mean, the great example is Brookings, right? So in recent years, Brookings did a lot of work around kind of urban regeneration development. So they set up, you know, a sort of sub-institution to look into urban questions, and they nominated an advisory board. Now, you know, if you look at some of the big questions in our urban centres in the US or the UK, you know, we're looking at very complicated problems. So Brookings did a project on Hunter's Yard, which I think is it was an ex-Navy property in San Francisco. So we've got these urban centres where everyone wants to live and do business for agglomeration reasons, right? So the public authorities own the land, but they can't develop the land. And people will, in order to access the land to do entrepreneurial things or indeed live there, will have to deal with a mix of public-private actors. So it makes sense for you to get the relevant stakeholders in the room to talk about these urban questions. And the game for think tankers is not avoiding conflicts of interest, because the conflict of interest is there. You know, we're talking about how we use public land with the help of private sector actors for the good of wider societies in our overpopulated urban centres. You have to get the developers in the room. But obviously it doesn't look good from the outside. So you nominate this board made up of major developers. You don't actively communicate about what you're doing. You don't set the terms of debate. And then along comes, you know, the New York Times in the form of Eric Lippman, who is, you know, famous for his exposés of think tanks, and says, look at this crooked influence peddling with, you know, a renowned think tank getting into bed with private developers. It looks terrible. You have, you know, the director of Brookings at the time, Strobe Talbot, you know, getting up to write rebuttals on Medium, none of which particularly land. We haven't talked about the context we're operating in. We haven't talked about, you know, why think tanks operate in the way that they do. We haven't talked about the challenges of policy making. We haven't made it clear. And so the narrative is already there for people to say, you know, think tanks are organizations that peddle influence. And unless we get on the front foot about this and more proactive, then, you know, the narrative will remain and just be reinforced by default.
Should we be, like, you know, concerned with, you know, the opinion of? So let me take one step. I think we all look at it. We all accept within this group that, like, you know, that very few people, like, you know, in our respective countries, you know, actually know what a think tank is, right? Or know what a think tank does. I mean, in fact, like, you know, we've, you know, from having, like, taken part in a number of, like, you know, on Think Tanks conference, like, you know, events, conversations, etc., you'd probably struggle to get, you know, a room of think tankers to agree on what a think tank is. So that being said, it doesn't stop people from forming an opinion about about think tanks, regardless of whether they understand, you know, what think tanks do or not. Should we be, like, you know, should we be interested or concerned, or does it matter what, like, you know, what people who are not interested in politics think about, like, you know, think about, you know, think tanks, you know, or, like, you know, or the exercise of, like, you know, the exercise of power in pluralistic societies that, you know, think tanks embody. Anyone want to take that one?
Sure, I can start. I think it's a choice for each organization of how you want to pursue the change and what are the values you stand behind. The organization that I've led, and I'm still a member of the executive board of Belgrade Center for Security Policy, was established to do checks and balances through research on the work of police, military, intelligence, and so on. And for us, the big change was just to educate the citizens that all of us civilians have a right to ask difficult questions, to demand information, and collect evidence on what these institutions are doing on our behalf. And in order to do this, we had to explain what we were doing, why we were doing, what is in it for them. And then I think now, when things are no longer, there is no longer openness of the government to engage, and there is more pressure, it is even more, it's kind of existential to explain why you exist and what you are doing, because more and more for our core work, we depend on actually getting evidence from citizens, because institutions are becoming more closed. They're avoiding responding to requests for information. They refuse direct engagement that we used to have, like, you know, different kinds of focus groups, meetings, and so on. So then if you want evidence, then you depend on getting it from citizens and whistleblowers from institutions. And for that, you need to explain who you are, what you do, what's the difference that you make, and what's the integrity that you wanna defend. So which language you are going to use, I don't think I would use a think tank. Maybe probably not even research, but more focus on what's the public good we stand behind, and then later explain how we do it.
Tom, any thoughts on on engaging those who are not interested in politics? Does it matter?
I know we have lots of Castro members here, and also John Schwartz. So you'll all love to hear me say this, but branding matters, and think tankers, I think it's fair to say, get dragged kicking and screaming into branding meetings. But eventually they do it, and they find some difficult truths there. I mean, I can speak from my own experience here. I used to run the press office at the Institute for Fiscal Studies. And so much depends, you know, day to day on what the journalist is prepared to introduce you as. So, you know, a lot of think tanks, a lot of institutions depend on how they're perceived, you know, amongst, you know, intermediaries, you know, we could say broadcasters, we could say other people who are in the ecosystem, to know of their reputation. But, you know, the public doesn't know that the IFS, you know, is independent and not, you know, politically balanced in one way or another. They don't know the different types of economics they're doing. They don't know, for example, why you won't answer the macroeconomic questions. And so when you don't go into the macro, because you're a microeconomist, people think that you're being shifty. So yeah, the public don't understand where you're coming from. And unless you're not only, you know, doing the branding work, but, you know, going a bit further than that and really telling people who you are and why you're doing it, there is always the risk, of course, that people think that, you know, you are some nameless, faceless institution. But it's not just the public you need to worry about. You know, the same is true of the next generation of, you know, news producers who, you know, won't know the difference between your August 100-year-old institution and, you know, some other organization which is called an institute. You know, we're in conditions of information overload, and that affects not only the public who, you know, famously, and you can poll them about it, you know, aren't familiar with the details of political issues, definitely haven't spent time researching your organization. It doesn't just affect the public, it also affects, you know, your partners, the people that you work with, the people you depend upon to connect you with the public if you're not doing public outreach.
Thank you. Natallia, do you want to say a few words about about Belarus and the kind of what the the challenges, I guess, for think tanks and
Sure. I was just processing Tom's comment on sort of branding that matters for other organizations, and I just remembered from Sonya's sessions yesterday that you were talking a lot about the countries in transition, in this democratic transition, and that the networking and expanding the networking and think tanks was actually partially a solution, partially a drive for a change. With regard to the Belarus, it's quite an interesting and very complicated environment, I would have to say, and I think because mainly people are not choosing to engage into the violent way of changing the situation in the country. So obviously this hopefully transitional stage is just being prolonged and delayed because of that. But in terms of coming back to think tanks, I think actually in both in Russia and in Belarus, there is this potential or maybe interest in the research institutions, mostly not internally, but externally, of providing the ways and solutions to change the policy among the people. So in Russia, for example, it's becoming, for independent think tanks, it's becoming more harder and harder to actually operate, because just recently, again, they introduced the law on education law that basically everyone outside academic institution have to agree their educational activities with the authorities. And the changes that they introduced, that for if you receive foreign budgeting, you need to register as a foreign agent. But I think those restrictions are actually connected with the interest of the public toward this knowledge, toward those organizations that operate. And I think it's just about seeing this potential and interest to engaging with public on those issues.
Thank you, everyone. And we will see everyone hopefully in the coffee room.